I thought I bought a house. Turns out, I accidentally acquired a major international border. That is the only explanation I have for why a homeowners association president began treating my driveway like it was under United Nations jurisdiction. According to her, it was not concrete, it was critical infrastructure. Apparently, letting delivery trucks cross my property made me some kind of logistics dictator. Next thing I knew, she was sending letters, drawing maps, and hosting town hall meetings like I had blocked humanitarian aid. And all I wanted to do was park my truck and sand some wood. If you think that sounds ridiculous, you are absolutely correct. Before things spiral even further, drop a comment. What would you do if your neighbor tried to annex your driveway? I am genuinely curious and mildly concerned. What I didn't realize at first was that my property had a very unique geographical advantage. You see, Cedar Springs had strange 1970s planning, lots of odd slopes and street layouts. The HOA neighborhood called Millbrook Heights sat on slightly elevated ground, and due to the way the streets were laid out and the natural slope of the land, delivery trucks, moving vans, and any large service vehicles literally could not access the neighborhood directly. The only practical route for anything bigger than a regular car was to come through my driveway, cross my property, and enter the HOA from the backside. The previous homeowner, an elderly gentleman named Frank, had been letting neighbors use this route for deliveries for over 20 years. It was just a neighborly thing to do, you know? Frank never charged anyone, never made a big deal about it. It was just understood that if you lived in Millbrook Heights and needed a furniture delivery or a moving truck, you'd call Frank, ask permission, and drive through his property. I learned all this from Frank himself during our closing meeting. Frank joked, "You're about to be popular, son." I laughed, not realizing he was warning me about Vivian McAllister. Her name was Vivian McAllister, and within 48 hours of me moving in, she would show me exactly what happens when someone gets drunk on the tiniest bit of authority. Frank warned me about her, actually. As he handed over the keys, he said, "Watch out for that McAllister woman. She's been sniffing around here for months, asking questions about the driveway situation, something about wanting to formalize the arrangement." He paused, shaking his head. "I told her it was just neighbors helping neighbors, but she kept talking about liability and property values and official agreements." The first week was peaceful. I got a few waves from neighbors, watched the occasional delivery truck rumble past my workshop window, and started settling into what I thought would be a quiet, productive life. Then, on a sunny Thursday morning, exactly 8 days after I'd moved in, Vivian McAllister knocked on my door. She wore a stiff smile and a cheap-looking blazer. "You must be Robert," she said, extending a manicured hand. Her handshake was too firm, her eye contact too long. As I invited her in and we sat at my kitchen table, I noticed she kept glancing out the window toward my driveway. Not casual glances, but calculating looks, like she was measuring something. "So," she said, settling into her chair and smoothing her skirt, "Frank probably told you about our little delivery arrangement." I nodded, taking a bite of the chocolate chip cookies she'd brought. "He did. Seems like it's worked well for everyone." Vivian's smile got a little tighter. "Oh, it has. It really has. But you know, Robert, times change, liability concerns, insurance issues, wear and tear on your beautiful driveway." She gestured toward the window. "I've been thinking we might need to explore some kind of formal partnership." The way she said partnership made alarm bells go off in my head. "What kind of partnership?" I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. Vivian leaned forward, her eyes lighting up with what I now recognize was greed, disguised as enthusiasm. "Well, the HOA could help with maintenance costs, maybe contribute to driveway improvements, that sort of thing. In exchange, we just need some input on scheduling, maybe some coordination with our community standards. Have you ever thought about monetizing this convenience you provide? I mean, you're essentially running a crucial piece of community infrastructure here." That last sentence hit me like a cold slap. Monetizing? Community infrastructure? This woman had been in my house for less than 15 minutes and she was already talking about turning my driveway into some kind of business venture. I could see the wheels turning in her head, and I didn't like where they were going. "I appreciate the offer, Vivian," I said carefully, "but I think I'll just continue what Frank was doing. Keep it simple, keep it neighborly." Her smile faltered for just a second, but she recovered quickly. Of course. I just want you to know we're here to support you in any way we can." She stood up, smoothing her blazer again. "We'll definitely need to discuss this more soon, though. There are some community considerations we should address." As I walked her to the door, she turned back one more time, her eyes scanning my driveway with that calculating look. "Robert, we really do need to talk about the traffic situation. Soon. There was something in her tone that wasn't friendly anymore. It was a promise, and not the good kind. 3 days after Vivian's visit, I found an official-looking letter in my mailbox. The return address read, Millbrook Heights, HOA, Office of the President, in formal lettering that was clearly meant to intimidate. Inside was a typed document titled Driveway Usage Coordination Request, with more official language than should ever be necessary between neighbors. The letter started friendly enough, thanking me for continuing the tradition of community cooperation established by the previous property owner, but then it got weird. Vivian was proposing what she called a mutually beneficial partnership arrangement, where the HOA would assist with maintenance and improvement costs for the shared access route in exchange for collaborative scheduling and community standards coordination. She wanted me to submit a monthly schedule of when I'd be using my own driveway. She wanted input on what types of vehicles could use it and when. Most bizarre of all, she suggested the HOA could help offset the wear and tear by collecting a small access contribution from residents who needed delivery services. I called Frank that afternoon. Frank sighed. Knew she'd try that. She was sniffing around the last month I was here, asking about liability and if I'd ever thought of charging. That confirmed what I already suspected. Vivian saw my driveway as her ticket to expanded power and revenue. The next morning, I got my first real taste of what Vivian had in mind. I was in my workshop around 10 a.m. when I heard a truck rumbling up my driveway. Through the window, I could see it was a big furniture delivery truck heading toward the Williams house. Nothing unusual about that, but then I noticed a white car following behind. Vivian's sedan. She arrived with a clipboard and stopwatch, ready to act like a traffic officer. I watched in disbelief as she started timing the delivery, taking photos of the truck, writing notes about vehicle size and duration. When the delivery guys came back down my driveway, she flagged them down and started asking questions. That's when I decided to go outside. Morning, Vivian, I called out. Everything okay here? She looked up from her clipboard with that practiced smile. Oh, Robert, perfect timing. I'm just documenting our current traffic patterns for the coordination proposal I sent you. She gestured toward the delivery truck, which was now idling uncertainly. These gentlemen were very helpful in providing details about delivery scheduling and vehicle specifications. I looked at the two delivery guys, who clearly just wanted to get back to their route. Are they having some kind of problem? Oh no problem at all, Vivian said quickly. I was just explaining our new coordination system, making sure everyone understands the proper procedures for using community infrastructure. My private driveway had suddenly become community infrastructure in her mind. Actually, I said, keeping my voice steady, this is private property. My private property. These guys are just trying to do their job. Vivian's smile tightened a fraction. Of course it's your property, Robert, but when it serves our entire community, we need proper management protocols. I stepped forward. Guys, just ignore all this. You're welcome to use my driveway anytime you need to make deliveries to the neighborhood. That's how it's always worked, and that's how it's going to keep working. The relief on their faces was obvious. They thanked me, got back in their truck, and drove off, leaving Vivian and me standing in tense silence. Robert, she said finally, I think you're misunderstanding the scope of what we're dealing with here. This isn't just about being neighborly anymore. We have liability concerns, insurance implications, proper documentation requirements. What if someone gets hurt? What if there's property damage? What if the city decides our traffic patterns violate some ordinance? I stared at her, trying to process the mental gymnastics required to turn a simple neighborly favor into this bureaucratic nightmare. Vivian, people have been using this driveway for 20 years without any problems. Frank never had issues, I'm not having issues, and I don't see why we need to complicate something that works perfectly fine. Her eyes flashed with something that looked like anger, quickly covered by that fake smile. Frank didn't understand the legal complexities of our situation. Frank didn't have the community leadership experience to properly manage this kind of arrangement. That's when I realized this wasn't really about my driveway at all. This was about power. Vivian wanted control over something, anything, that would make her feel important and give her leverage over her neighbors. My driveway just happened to be the perfect target because it was genuinely essential to the neighborhood. Control the access, control the people. I appreciate your concern, Vivian, I said, but I'm going to handle this the same way Frank did. Simple, neighborly, and without a bunch of bureaucratic complications. She clutched her clipboard tighter. I don't think you understand what you're taking on, Robert. This is community responsibility we're talking about. This affects the whole neighborhood. We need proper control. I watched as she gathered her things, muttering about proper procedures and community standards, and I knew this conversation was far from over. As she drove away, I stood in my driveway looking at the path that connected my property to the neighborhood, and I realized I wasn't just dealing with an overzealous HOA president. I was dealing with someone who saw my driveway as her path to power, and she wasn't going to let property rights stand in her way. The way she'd talked about monetizing and management protocols made it clear she had bigger plans than just neighborhood cooperation. She wanted to turn my property into her personal kingdom, with herself as the gatekeeper who decided who could come and go. But I'd been dealing with difficult clients my whole career as a carpenter. I knew the difference between someone trying to solve a problem and someone trying to create one they could control. Vivian McAllister was definitely in the second category. The next week, things escalated in a way I never could have predicted. I came home from a job site on Tuesday to find an official city envelope in my mailbox. My heart sank as I opened it. The letter was from the Cedar Springs Planning and Zoning Department, informing me that they'd received a formal complaint about potential unauthorized commercial use of residential property for delivery access. They were requesting documentation of my property boundaries, traffic patterns, and usage logs for the past 6 months. The complaint form was even more disturbing. Someone had filed paperwork claiming that my driveway was being used as an unofficial commercial delivery route that violated residential zoning laws and created public safety hazards. The complaint was anonymous, but I didn't need Sherlock Holmes to figure out who'd filed it. Vivian McAllister was escalating this fight to the government level, and she was trying to get the city to shut down delivery access to the entire neighborhood. What I learned from researching property law was both reassuring and terrifying. Reassuring because my property was clearly zoned residential. I had every right to allow deliveries through my driveway, and there was no legal basis for the city to restrict normal residential delivery traffic. Terrifying because I realized what Vivian's real strategy was. If she could get the city to classify my driveway as commercial due to the volume of neighborhood deliveries, they might ban heavy vehicles entirely. That would cut off delivery access to the entire HOA, forcing residents to sue me for an easement to restore their access. Create a crisis, blame me for the crisis, then use the crisis to legally force me to give the HOA control over my property. It was diabolical, really. The next morning, I made a decision that would change everything. If Vivian wanted to play property line games, I was going to give her property lines she couldn't ignore. I drove to the hardware store and bought professional-grade white paint, measuring tape, and stakes. I marked my property line with a bright white stripe and spaced signs every 10 feet. Parlor property, Harrison, residence. A camera watched it all. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Within an hour, I had neighbors stopping by to ask what was going on. Christian Ellis, an electrician who lived in the HOA, was the first. "Hey Robert, saw you painting out there. Everything okay?" Christian was a good guy, mid-30s, the kind of neighbor who'd lend you tools without being asked. "Just making sure everyone knows where my property line is," I said. "I've been having some discussions with the HOA about delivery access." Christian nodded slowly. "Vivian been giving you trouble?" "She's been asking a lot of questions around the neighborhood about property values and community standards. Seems really worked up about something." By late afternoon, word had spread through the neighborhood because I could see people driving by slowly, checking out the white line. Around 5 p.m., I got my first test case. A package delivery truck turned onto my street and approached the white line. The driver stopped, clearly uncertain about whether to cross it. I walked outside and waved him through. "You're good," I called out. "Just crossing private property to make a delivery." The driver nodded gratefully and continued toward the HOA. 20 minutes later, on his way out, he gave me a thumbs up. Simple, friendly, exactly the way it should be. But I knew Vivian wouldn't see it that way. At exactly 6:15 p.m., a white sedan pulled up to my white line and stopped. Vivian McAllister got out of her car like she was preparing for battle, wearing her most official blazer and carrying an even bigger clipboard than before. She stood at the white line for a full minute, hands on her hips, staring at my handiwork like it was a personal insult. Then she walked directly across it and marched up my driveway toward my front door. I watched from my window as she crossed the line, making sure my new camera captured everything. When she knocked, I took my time answering. "Robert," she said, not bothering with pleasantries this time, "what exactly is this?" She gestured toward the white line like it was radioactive. "That's my property line, Vivian." I thought it might be helpful if everyone knew exactly where private property begins. Her face was flushed, whether from anger or embarrassment I couldn't tell. "This is completely unnecessary and frankly hostile. It makes our neighborhood look like some kind of fortress." I kept my voice calm and reasonable. It's just a clear boundary marker. Helps everyone understand what's private property and what's public space. Vivian's composure was slipping. You can't just paint lines across community infrastructure. I can paint lines on my own property, I replied, which is what I did. She stepped closer, her voice getting louder. This affects the entire community. People are asking questions. Property values could be impacted. You're creating division and hostility. Vivian, I'm just clarifying ownership. If people want to use my driveway for deliveries, they're welcome to. The line doesn't change anything except making it clear whose property they're crossing. But she wasn't listening to reason anymore. This is aggressive behavior, Robert. This is meant to intimidate and control community access. Her voice was getting shrill. I won't stand for this kind of divisive action in our neighborhood. That's when she made her first big mistake. In her anger, she took another step toward me, putting herself even deeper onto my property, while simultaneously arguing that my property line markers were somehow inappropriate. Vivian, I said quietly, you just trespassed across that line while complaining about me marking my boundaries. My camera caught the whole thing. She looked back at the white line, then at the camera, and I could see the moment she realized her mistake. Her face went from red to pale in about 2 seconds. I was just trying to have a conversation with you about community concerns, she stammered, which you could have done from the other side of that line, or by asking permission to come onto my property, I pointed out. Instead, you just proved exactly why I needed to mark the boundaries in the first place. She gathered herself, trying to regain some authority. This isn't over, Robert. You want to play property line games? Fine. I'll show you what real property control looks like. As she stomped back across my white line toward her car, she turned back one more time. You have no idea what you're dealing with. I watched her drive away and I realized she was probably right. I didn't know what I was dealing with, but I was starting to get the feeling I was about to find out. The white line had done exactly what I'd hoped. It had forced Vivian to show her true colors. She wasn't interested in cooperation or community harmony. She wanted control, pure and simple, and my property line had just made it impossible for her to pretend otherwise. 3 days after the White Line incident, Vivian called an emergency HOA meeting. The notice that appeared in everyone's mailbox was dramatic enough to make you think we were dealing with a natural disaster. Urgent, community access crisis, emergency session of the Millbrook Heights HOA board, mandatory attendance requested. I wasn't technically required to attend since I didn't live within the HOA boundaries, but the notice specifically mentioned addressing property boundary aggression and community access rights, so I figured I'd better show up to defend myself. The meeting started at 7 p.m. in the community center. I arrived early and found the room packed. Vivian had prepared a PowerPoint presentation, complete with a laser pointer and slides designed to make me look like a public menace. She even set one lone chair front and center, clearly reserved for me, the defendant in her community trial. The room buzzed with murmurs about property lines, blocked access, and plunging home values. Vivian opened with dramatic flair, declaring a community emergency. We're here tonight to address a serious threat to our community's well-being and property values. She clicked her laser pointer and the first slide appeared. Morrison Drive Crisis, Protecting Community Access Rights. The second slide was an aerial photo of my property with my driveway highlighted in red, labeled Critical Community Infrastructure. The third slide showed a close-up photo of my white line with the caption, Aggressive Boundary Marking, Intimidation Tactics. As you can see, Vivian continued, pacing like a prosecutor making her closing argument, Robert Harrison has escalated a simple community coordination discussion into what can only be described as hostile property control. She clicked to the next slide, which showed a timeline of events that made it look like I'd declared war on the neighborhood without provocation. According to her version, she'd simply reached out to welcome me and discuss standard community coordination procedures, and I'd responded by implementing intimidation tactics and restricting community access. The next few slides were even more creative. She'd somehow obtained photos of delivery trucks using my driveway and calculated estimated wear and tear costs, insurance liability exposure, and potential property damage. The slide that really got the crowd's attention was titled Safety Concerns and Legal Liability. Vivian had researched actual accidents involving delivery vehicles and residential properties, none of which had anything to do with my situation, but which painted a terrifying picture of potential lawsuits and insurance claims. The question before us tonight, she said, building to her climax, is whether we allow one individual to hold our entire community hostage with aggressive property control tactics, or whether we take action to protect our residents' rights and safety. She clicked to her final slide, Proposed Emergency Access Protocol. Her proposal was breathtaking in its audacity. She wanted the HOA to formally declare my driveway essential community infrastructure and petition the city to establish an emergency access easement. In plain English, she wanted the government to force me to give the HOA legal control over my property. But that wasn't the end of it. Her protocol also included community standards coordination for any vehicles using the driveway, liability insurance requirements for property owners providing access, and usage fees to cover maintenance and insurance costs. She was literally proposing to steal my driveway, charge my neighbors for using it, and make me pay for the privilege of having it stolen. When she finished her presentation, she opened the floor for discussion, and that's when things got interesting. The first person to speak was Margaret Thompson, an elderly woman who lived closest to the HOA entrance. "I'm confused," she said. "Is Mr. Harrison actually blocked anyone from making deliveries? Because I just had my new refrigerator delivered yesterday and the truck went right through his driveway like always." Vivian's smile got tight. "Margaret, the issue isn't current access. The issue is the vulnerability created by depending on one individual's goodwill for essential services." But Margaret pressed on. "So he hasn't actually blocked anyone?" "Well, no, but the point is..." "So what exactly is the emergency?" Christian Ellis raised his hand next. "I've lived here for 8 years and Frank never had any problems with this arrangement. Why are we treating it like a crisis now?" Other residents started sharing their own experiences with deliveries, and a pattern emerged that was very different from Vivian's dramatic presentation. Everyone had gotten their deliveries without problems. No one had been charged fees or faced bureaucratic obstacles. The only change was that there was now a white line marking where private property began. That's when Ashley Martinez, the HOA secretary, dropped the bombshell that changed everything. Ashley was young, maybe late 20s, with the kind of quiet competence that you don't notice until someone shows real courage. She'd been taking notes silently through the whole meeting, but now she stood up with a folder in her hands. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, "but there are some things the board needs to know before we vote on any emergency protocols." Vivian's face went white. "Ashley, this isn't the time for administrative details." But Ashley continued anyway. "I've been researching the legal basis for HOA authority over private property outside our boundaries, and according to our bylaws and state law, we have no jurisdiction over Mr. Harrison's property at all." She opened her folder and pulled out several documents. "I also found some email communications that suggest this emergency protocol isn't really about safety or access." The room went dead silent. "What kind of communications?" Christian asked. Ashley took a deep breath. "Emails discussing ways to claim easement rights over Mr. Harrison's driveway, research into charging residents fees for delivery services, and discussions about using access control to generate revenue for the HOA." The explosion of voices that followed was immediate and angry. "Revenue? Charging us for deliveries? What the hell is going on here?" Vivian tried to regain control. "Those were preliminary discussions about cost recovery, administrative considerations, but the damage was done." When the vote was finally called on Vivian's emergency protocol, it failed by a margin of 12-3. Only Vivian's closest allies supported it, and even they looked uncomfortable after Ashley's revelation. As the meeting broke up, I could hear residents talking among themselves, and the tone had completely shifted. Instead of seeing me as the problem, they were starting to ask hard questions about what their HOA president was really up to. As I walked to my car, Ashley caught up with me. "Mr. Harrison, I owe you an apology. I should have spoken up sooner about what I was seeing in those emails." I shook her hand gratefully. "Thank you for speaking up at all. That took courage." She looked back toward the community center, where Vivian was standing alone, gathering her presentation materials. "I don't think this is over," she said quietly. "She's been planning something big, and tonight didn't go the way she expected." I should have known Vivian wouldn't give up after her public humiliation at the HOA meeting. 2 days after the meeting, I woke up to find a city inspector standing in my driveway at 7 a.m., clipboard in hand, measuring tape in the other. He was a middle-aged guy in a city uniform who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. "Mr. Harrison? I'm Jeff Morrison from Cedar Springs Planning and Zoning. We received a formal complaint about unauthorized commercial use of your residential property." He held up an official document thick enough to choke a horse. "I need to conduct an inspection and document current usage patterns." As Jeff explained the complaint, I realized Vivian had outdone herself. She'd filed paperwork claiming I was running essentially a trucking business through my driveway, charging or benefiting financially from delivery access and creating safety hazards with commercial vehicle traffic in a residential area. It was all complete fiction, but it was detailed, professional fiction, backed up with photos, traffic counts, and what looked like legitimate safety concerns. "Here's the thing, Mr. Harrison," Jeff said, looking genuinely sympathetic. "If we determine this is commercial use, we'll have to restrict delivery vehicles. That would mean no trucks over a certain weight limit, which would pretty much eliminate furniture deliveries, appliance installations, moving vans, that sort of thing. Those folks would lose all practical delivery access." I stared at him. "So by trying to prove I'm running a business, she'd actually cut off deliveries to the people she claims to represent?" Jeff shrugged. "Politics aren't my department, sir. I just enforce zoning regulations." That afternoon, Ashley Martinez called. She warned me that Vivian was spreading panic, telling neighbors I'd lose delivery access soon and they'd be forced to sue me. Vivian claimed only her plan could avoid legal chaos and protect them. The inspection lasted 3 days. Jeff Morrison timed trucks, measured distances, and talked to neighbors. On the second day, Vivian showed up with binders and commentary. By the third, I knew it was time to go on offense. While Jeff measured, I interviewed delivery drivers, collecting proof. They'd always used my driveway, had never paid fees, and had no other way into the HOA. The answers painted a clear picture. This was residential delivery service that had worked smoothly for 20 years. I'd never charged anyone a penny, and there were no practical alternatives for large vehicles. On Thursday afternoon, Jeff finished his inspection and sat down with me to discuss his findings. "Mr. Harrison, I'll be honest with you. The complaint alleges commercial use, but what I'm seeing is residential delivery service. Your neighbors are getting furniture, appliances, and moving services, which is normal residential activity. However, the complaint does raise some valid points about traffic volume and the dependency of an entire neighborhood on your private property." He paused, looking at his notes. "Here's the situation. If I rule this is residential use, you're in the clear. But the complainant can't appeal, and frankly, the volume of traffic does push the boundaries of normal residential delivery. On the other hand, if I rule it's commercial use, I'll have to ban delivery vehicles over a certain size. That would effectively cut off delivery access to about 25 families. There is one other thing," Jeff said, and something in his tone made me pay attention. "The property owner has absolute right to control access to their property. Residential or commercial, you can restrict or allow whatever traffic you want. The city can't force you to provide access, and we can't prevent you from denying access." The implication hit me like lightning. Jeff was telling me that regardless of how he ruled on the commercial use question, I had the legal right to simply shut down all delivery access if I wanted to. Vivian's entire strategy depended on me continuing to allow deliveries while she maneuvered to steal control of the process. But what if I didn't? What if I just stopped? The next morning, I put a plan into action. I drove to the hardware store and bought materials for a project that would change everything. A simple but effective gate system across my driveway entrance. Not the kind of aggressive barrier that would make me look like the neighborhood villain, but a clear, professional boundary that would give me complete control over who could access my property and when. I spent the weekend building a wooden gate that matched the aesthetic of my property, complete with a lock and an intercom system connected to my workshop. The gate opened and closed easily, but it sent an unmistakable message. This was private property, and access was now by permission only. On Sunday evening, I installed the final piece of my strategy, a large, professionally made sign that read, "Public property, access by permission only, press intercom button." I also set up a simple schedule and printed cards with access codes for neighbors who'd been reasonable throughout this whole mess. Monday morning brought my first test case. A delivery truck approached my gate and stopped, clearly uncertain about how to proceed. The driver got out and pressed the intercom button. "Hi, this is Mike from Johnson Delivery. I've got a refrigerator for the Anderson family in Millbrook Heights." I pressed the button to open the gate. "Come on through, Mike. Just follow the driveway back and around to the left. Simple, friendly, exactly the way it should work." By noon, word had spread through the neighborhood that I'd installed a gate. My phone started ringing with calls from concerned residents who'd heard various versions of what was happening, but the smart ones, like Christian Ellis, understood immediately what I was doing. "Brilliant move, Robert," he said when he called. "You're controlling the narrative now. Every time someone gets a delivery through your gate, it proves you're being reasonable. And every time Vivian complains about the gate, she looks like she's trying to control your property." That afternoon, I got the call I'd been expecting. Robert, this is Vivian McAllister. I need to speak with you immediately about this gate situation. Her voice was strained, like she was trying very hard to sound calm and failing. What about it, Vivian? You can't just block community access with some kind of fortress gate. I'm not blocking anything. People just need to ask permission to use my private property. This is exactly the kind of hostile behavior I warned everyone about. I could hear the desperation creeping into her voice. Actually, Vivian, this is exactly the kind of property control you said the community needed. I'm just making sure it's done properly. The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know. Her plan was falling apart and she knew it. Tuesday morning, I heard shouting and looked outside. Vivian stood at my gate with 8 supporters and protest signs like "Free Our Deliveries." She looked frazzled, hair messy, blazer wrinkled, and was ranting to a news reporter who'd shown up. I decided to go outside and see what exactly was happening on my property line. As I approached the gate from the inside, I could hear Vivian's voice getting louder and more theatrical. "This man is holding our community hostage. People need medical deliveries and he's cutting them off." The reporter asked calmly, "Has he refused anyone?" Vivian snapped, "That's not the point. It's about intimidation." I walked up to my side of the gate and pressed the intercom button. "Good morning, Vivian. Is there something I can help you with?" The crowd turned toward me, and I could see the reporter's eyes light up with interest. "Robert Harrison," Vivian declared dramatically, "this gate is an assault on our community's rights and values." I kept my voice calm and reasonable. "It's a gate on my private property, Vivian. People just need to ask permission to use my driveway, which is how it should have always been." The reporter stepped forward. "Mr. Harrison, I'm Jennifer Walsh from Channel 7 News. Can you explain the situation here?" I nodded toward Vivian's protesters. "These folks are upset that I installed a gate on my own property. I've been letting neighbors use my driveway for deliveries as a courtesy, but some people wanted to turn that courtesy into a business arrangement. I decided I needed better control over my property." Jennifer turned to Vivian. "Mrs. McAllister, Mr. Harrison says he's still allowing deliveries by request. What's the specific problem with that arrangement?" Vivian's composure cracked a little. "The problem is the psychological impact, the intimidation factor, the suggestion that people need permission to access essential services." That's when Christian Ellis arrived, and I could see he'd brought several other neighbors with him. But instead of joining Vivian's protest, they walked up to my gate and pressed the intercom button. "Hey Robert, it's Christian. We were wondering if we could talk to you about this whole situation." I opened the gate and invited them onto my property, which created a visual that perfectly illustrated the real dynamic. As Jennifer Walsh interviewed various neighbors, a clear pattern emerged. People who had actually tried to schedule deliveries had no problems with the gate system. The only people complaining were those who hadn't needed deliveries, but were upset about the principle of needing permission to cross private property. Christian made the point that finally cut through all of Vivian's rhetoric. "Look, I'm an electrician. I understand property boundaries and liability issues. If Robert wants to control access to his property, that's his right. The fact that he's still letting us use his driveway for deliveries is generous, not hostile." But the real bombshell came when Ashley Martinez arrived with a folder full of documents. She'd been doing more research into Vivian's communications, and what she'd found was devastating. "Jennifer," she said, approaching the reporter, "I think you need to see some emails that put this whole conflict in context." Ashley opened her folder and pulled out printed copies of messages she'd found in the HOA's email system. The first email was from Vivian to a consulting company, asking about revenue opportunities for community access management. The second was to a law firm, inquiring about procedures for claiming easement rights over private property. The third was to several HOA board members, outlining a plan to create documentation of dependency on Harrison property to support future legal action. Jennifer's eyes widened as she read the emails. "Was repeated enough. Miss Martinez, are you saying this conflict was planned in advance?" Ashley nodded. "These emails go back 3 months, long before Mr. Harrison installed his gate or even marked his property line. Miss McAllister has been planning to gain control over his driveway since he moved in." The effect on the crowd was immediate and dramatic. Vivian's supporters started looking uncomfortable as the real story came out. Several of them walked away during Ashley's explanation, clearly realizing they'd been manipulated into supporting something they didn't understand. Vivian herself looked like she was watching her entire world collapse in real time. "Those emails were taken out of context," she protested. "I was exploring options for community protection," but Jennifer was a good reporter and pressed for details. "What kind of protection requires claiming easement rights over someone else's property?" Vivian's answer was a rambling mess about liability and community standards that made her sound desperate and grasping. Meanwhile, I stood quietly by my gate, letting the evidence speak for itself. When Jennifer asked me for comment, I simply said, "I think the emails make it pretty clear what this was really about. I just wanted to protect my property rights and continue helping my neighbors in a reasonable way." The news segment that aired that evening was devastating for Vivian. Jennifer had done her homework and presented a clear timeline. Vivian had been planning to gain control over my property months before any conflict arose. She'd manipulated neighborhood concerns to build support for her plan, and when I'd responded with reasonable boundary markers and access controls, she'd escalated to protests and media attention. The segment showed her looking frantic and unreasonable, while I appeared calm and cooperative. More importantly, it included interviews with neighbors who confirmed that deliveries were still happening smoothly through the gate system. By Wednesday morning, Vivian's support had collapsed entirely. Residents who'd been neutral or mildly supportive were now actively calling for her removal from the HOA board. Christian Ellis called me that afternoon with news that the HOA was calling an emergency vote of no confidence in Vivian's leadership. The emails Ashley found were the last straw, he said. People realized they were being used as pawns in her scheme to steal your property. That evening, Ashley stopped by with more news. "The city inspector called me today. Apparently, Vivian tried to pressure him to rule your driveway was commercial use, even after his investigation showed it was clearly residential service." Jeff Morrison wasn't happy about the attempted manipulation. As I stood in my workshop that night, looking out at my gate and the white line that had started this whole conflict, I realized that Vivian's attempt to steal my driveway had accomplished something she never intended. It had united the neighborhood against the kind of petty tyranny she represented. The emergency HOA meeting to vote on Vivian's removal was scheduled for Thursday evening, but by Wednesday afternoon it was already clear which way the wind was blowing. I spent Wednesday morning installing a keypad system that would allow regular delivery services to access my property without using the intercom every time. It was a practical solution that demonstrated my commitment to making deliveries work smoothly for everyone. Several neighbors stopped by during the installation to check out the new system and chat about the upcoming vote. The consensus was unanimous. Vivian McAllister had to go. Christian Ellis summed up the general feeling. Nobody trusts her anymore. The emails Ashley found showed she was playing chess while the rest of us thought we were just having neighborhood discussions. Even Margaret Thompson, who'd initially been swayed by Vivian's presentations, had completely changed her tune. "I feel like such a fool," she told me. "This woman had me convinced you were some kind of threat to the neighborhood, when all along she was the one planning to steal your property." The Thursday meeting was packed, but the mood had changed. People were calm, united, and ready to act. Ashley ran the meeting smoothly, in sharp contrast to Vivian's past performances. The no-confident vote passed 18-2. Vivian gave a weak defense speech about community interests, but no one bought it. When she finished, the room was silent except for a few uncomfortable coughs. Christian stood and said, "Vivian, you used us to take someone else's property." After the vote, there was still the practical matter of rebuilding community relationships and establishing a new framework for delivery access. Ashley had prepared a neighborhood cooperation agreement that would formalize the delivery arrangement in a way that protected everyone's interests, without anyone trying to steal anyone else's property. The agreement was beautifully simple. I would continue to allow neighborhood deliveries through my property as a courtesy. The HOA would contribute a modest amount annually toward driveway maintenance, and everyone would respect the fact that access was a privilege, not a right. Most importantly, the agreement included language explicitly stating that the HOA had no claim to easement rights or property control, and that the arrangement could be modified or terminated by mutual agreement. It was exactly the kind of reasonable, neighborly solution that could have been reached months ago if Vivian hadn't been scheming to turn my driveway into her personal fiefdom. The agreement passed unanimously, and for the first time since I'd moved to Cedar Springs, I felt like I was actually part of a community instead of being under siege. The best part of the evening came when several neighbors approached me individually to apologize for being swayed by Vivian's manipulation. Tom Bradley apologized for believing Vivian. Emily Foster, a lawyer, offered to help me finalize the agreement for free. Even some of Vivian's former supporters went out of their way to express regret for doubting my motive. The whole experience reminded me why I'd wanted to live in a small community in the first place. When good people get accurate information, they generally make good decisions. Within a week, word came that Vivian had put her house up for sale and would be moving to a different state. The neighborhood she'd tried to control had rejected her entirely. Ashley Martinez was elected permanent HOA president, with a mandate to focus on practical community issues rather than power politics. The new board established clear guidelines for HOA authority that prevented future overreach attempts. My gate system became a model that several other neighborhoods inquired about copying. Most importantly, deliveries started flowing more smoothly than they ever had under the old, informal arrangement. The keypad system eliminated delays. The intercom provided clear communication for unusual requests, and the formal cooperation agreement gave everyone confidence that the system was stable and fair. I started getting thank you notes from delivery drivers who appreciated the clear process and professional setup. UPS, FedEx, and the local furniture companies all commented on how much easier their jobs had become with the organized access system. But perhaps the most satisfying outcome was watching the neighborhood rediscover its sense of community without Vivian's toxic influence. The monthly HOA meetings became actual problem-solving sessions instead of power display performances. 3 months after the vote, I was working in my shop when I heard a familiar sound, a delivery truck approaching my gate. But this time, instead of uncertainty and drama, everything worked exactly as it should. The truck stopped at the gate, the driver entered the access code, the gate opened smoothly, and 20 minutes later, the truck departed with a friendly wave. Simple, efficient, respectful of everyone's rights and interests. As I watched the truck disappear down the road, I reflected on what the whole experience had taught me. Vivian McAllister had tried to steal my driveway by creating a crisis and positioning herself as the solution. Instead, she'd taught an entire neighborhood about the importance of property rights, community cooperation, and honest leadership. Her scheme had backfired so completely that it had created exactly the opposite of what she'd intended: a stronger, more unified community where people respected each other's boundaries and worked together to solve problems. Standing in my driveway that evening, looking at the white line that had started it all and the gate that had ended it, I realized that sometimes the best way to shut down someone's grab for power isn't to fight them directly. Sometimes you just have to make their true intentions so clear that everyone else can see them for what they really are. Vivian had tried to steal my driveway and ended up losing everything she'd worked to build. The neighborhood she'd tried to control had rejected her entirely and chosen cooperation over manipulation. The property rights she'd tried to undermine had been strengthened and legally protected in ways that would prevent future attempts at the same kind of power grab. In the end, justice had been served, not through revenge or retaliation, but through transparency, community engagement, and the simple principle that good people, given accurate information, will generally do the right thing. They'd tried to steal my driveway, so I'd shut down their whole power game, and everyone was better off for it.